Okay. Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to our first ever online Llafur event. My name is Ian Rees, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. Firstly, many apologies that technological problems prevented the event from happening as originally planned last Saturday. However, I'm delighted so many of you have stuck with us and have been able to join us today for what promises to be a really interesting debate on a highly topical theme. The title of today's event is Memorialization and Welsh History, and the particular question that will be discussed is, should memorialization represent collective memory or contemporary conscience? As we all know, the public imagination has been gripped in recent weeks by what has often been an increasingly polarized debate surrounding the nature of memorialization, mostly centering on the place of statues in public spaces. Of course, we've all witnessed the toppling of Edward Colston's statue in Bristol Harbour, and we've heard the debates around the Roads Must Fall campaign in Oxford, and closer to home around the removal of Sir Thomas Picton's statue from Cardiff City Hall. Yet does the veneration of contentious individuals through memorialization represent history in a wider sense? And how does this debate play out specifically in a Welsh context? Here to discuss these issues today are Dr. Chris Hill and Darren Macey. A very warm welcome to you both. Chris is a lecturer in history at the University of South Wales, whose research interests centre around modern British and late imperial history, with a focus on histories of activism, internationalism, mass media, and social movements. Darren is well known to many of us as a valued member of the Llafur Executive Committee, a historian at the University of South Wales, and project officer on the Rhondda Cynon Sporting Heroes Past and Present initiative. He has a background in public history and is leading Rhondda Cynon current re-evaluation of memorialization in public spaces. There are also going to be some other contributors later in this discussion whom Darren will introduce. Delighted that you could both be here today, and I'm going to hand you over now to Darren, who will explain how the event will run and how you, the audience, can get involved by asking questions via chat. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, just to run through a couple of points. We've got a chat function on your screen. If you want to ask any questions, we'll collate all the questions and we'll put them to whoever you want to speak to right at the end of the program. So if you can address that question to an individual, whether that's myself, Chris, or Neil, Hywel, and Carolyn, who are going to join us later. So without taking up any more time, because I'm quite conscious that we are quite time critical this morning, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Dr. Chris Hill.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks for the introduction, Ian, as well. And thanks to the Society as a whole for inviting me to speak on this important theme at such a timely moment. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen with you all. Can everyone see that? Or Darren, can you confirm that you can see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So as Ian mentioned, my name is Chris Hill. I started with the University of South Wales in August 2019, last year. And one of the things I've been doing is a module which deals with the history of imperialism and race and nation in Britain. And it's the title of the module is Must Roads Fall, taken after the name of the Oxford Union debate around the 19th century colonialist Cecil Rhodes. And I suppose one of the key themes that students engage with in that module is the theoretical framework of historical memory, and particularly how historical memory is evoked by statues, monuments, buildings and landscapes. And that's what I'm going to discuss with you this morning. I'm going to try to perhaps offer a foundation for some of the other talks this morning by elaborating a little more about how statues are connected to issues of historical memory in our society. I'm going to do this more broadly in relation to British and Welsh history, and then you'll have some more focused examples, I think, on Welsh history. So I'm going to do this under the title, Why Statues Matter for Black Lives. When Trayvon Martin was shot dead and his killer, George Zimmerman, was acquitted of second-degree murder in 2013, the clarion call of Black Lives Matter inspired the basis of an entire social movement. And as we all know, in May this year, the shameful spectacle of George Floyd's death underlined the urgency of this message. In the context of this ongoing persecution of Black lives, the recent controversy around statues might seem misplaced. So why is it that statues matter? In short, I think they matter because they fix in stone and bronze the inequalities and prejudices of the past, which are also perpetuated in more complicated ways by institutions. And to this end, the felling of supremacist statues seems tantamount to an elementary step in structural change, an action far simpler than changing the curriculum or the composition of a boardroom. The felling of such statues embodies a practice, quite literally, of dismantling white supremacy. So to further grasp why statues matter, it is necessary to address the currency of meaning in which they trade, and this is what we've already mentioned, historical memory. Now, just because memories are of the past, this need not imply that they have no agency in the present. Indeed, the memories of Black lives as mattering less, through symbols of conquest, enslavement, and theft, may make it easier for Black lives to be treated as less. In its most extreme form, violence against Black citizens, this treatment often unfolds in places and spaces where historical violence against Black communities is also commemorated. Now, this is not to suggest that supremacist statues necessarily cause violence, but I think it does suggest that they make it more permissible. They are one element of a cultural ecology in which Black lives are infinitely diminished. So how statues evoke memory is also highly complex and context dependent. The recent controversy in the UK, for example, has drawn meaning not only from the death of George Floyd, but also from the EU referendum and the efforts of Conservative governments to push a celebratory brand of British history. As Fintan O'Toole, the Irish commentator, has remarked, the caricatured appropriation of Winston Churchill by Boris Johnson has altered and enriched the symbolic meaning of attacks on Churchill's statue. For O'Toole, this has meant that the biggest threat to the legacy of Churchill has not been Black Lives Matter, but Johnson himself. Yet the broadest context in which the recent controversy can be interpreted is as old as the most contested statues themselves. And this is because there's never been a complete consensus around British imperialism. It did not exist for Edward Colston, placed on his plinth in 1895, and neither did it exist for Cecil Rhodes, widely regarded by his contemporaries as an egomaniac. So the current reckoning over statues such as these is merely the most recent in a long line, with the peripheries of empire having negotiated this Britishness decades ago. And I think this is symbolized above all by statues of Queen Victoria, decapitated, defaced, and dismounted in Ireland, Guyana, and Quebec, among other places. And the image you can see there is of the decapitated statue of Queen Victoria from Quebec City, which was decapitated in a bombing by the Quebec Liberation Front in the 1960s. However, I think in the heartlands of former empire, the imperial cloak does not slip off quite so easily. The disrobing of the imperial past might be easier if it were not so interwoven with other memories of British history and civic identity, the most cherished being that of Britain standing alone in the Second World War. And I think it's fair to say that the British state is far more invested in this narrative than that of empire, despite occasional rhetoric around empire as a form of proto-globalization. And obviously we've seen this rhetoric increase over the past few years. And I'd go as far as to say that state-led efforts to cultivate memories of the Second World War are matched only by those to forget empire, most notably with the hidden archives on decolonization. These archives were, of course, hidden by the Foreign Office in Hanslope Park and have since been remigrated into the National Archives where they can be accessed by researchers. So as Fintan O'Toole explains again, I think this is why Churchill, a figure polarised between imperial racism and wartime leadership, is so difficult for the British state to give up on. Without him, the already creaking edifice of Britishness would come crumbling down. In the logical escalation from Colston to Churchill, the cry of where will it end has been raised. Does the complicity of historical figures in empire preclude the commemoration of their other, more positive civic contributions? One of the conventional approaches to the imperial past, the so-called moral audit, provides little help. The memory of contested figures, I think, cannot be legitimised on the basis of deeds to their credit as well as their deficit. So as one recent tweet cheekily put it, you cannot put up a statue of Jimmy Savile and say, don't worry, this is for his charitable work, not his paedophilia. So historical figures are fully formed and they should be judged as such. Yet I think this also requires the maintenance of a healthy sense of contradiction in the past. And the reunification of Germany, I think, offers a case in point. The historicus streit, historians dispute, and overcoming of the past, the German word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, try saying that after a few drinks, were key to the reconciliation of memory and identity in the new state. So if the nationalisms that replace Britishness are to encounter imperialism any more effectively, then their proponents need to reflect more on the role of their own nations in it. So as in the case of Plaid Cymru's campaign of reparation for Wales, a nationalist trope of victimhood can sometimes serve to obstruct and stifle this reflection. And I'm not saying that this is a distinctive problem of Welsh nationalism, but as I think it's a distinctive problem of all nationalisms as far as I'm concerned. Ernst Renan, the French scholar of nationalism, in his essay on the subject, talked about nationalism as being something defined by painful memories and by memories of suffering more than memories of success and victory. So the moment that memories evoked by statues translate into other forms of action around statues, whether in the form of a defense or a toppling, also marks a watershed for this analysis. At this point, the historian is concerned not only with memory, but also with public history. And as historians ranging from David Olusoga to Richard Evans have remarked, it should be obvious that statues themselves are not history. The past is not erased when statues are taken down. History books remain the same. But in one sense, the equation of statues with history has been a tactic of reactionaries who speak of the erasure of our, in other words, white past. Ironically, those who protest against the erasure of this past are often the same people who ask Black communities to jettison theirs and move on. Yet, as long as citizens debate statues, and as long as these debates shape what statues go up and come down, statues do remain a focal point around which history can be interpreted and revised. This form of historical engagement is best described as public history, a field defined by Jürgen Habermas, one of the chief protagonists of the historicus streit, as the, quote, political conversion of the past for the purposes of the present. So the task of making sure this conversion is informed and representative and does not succumb to the hollowness of political populism belongs to historians and heritage professionals. And I say this being quite conscious as a white person of an all-white panel this morning, but more than ever, I would say that the interventions of historians and heritage professionals into how the imperial past is handled needs to be made in collaboration with the diverse communities that public history is meant to represent. And this is actually a tried and tested practice. So in antiquity, the statues of figures who had fallen out of favour would be removed by the common principle of damnatio memoriae, the condescension of memory, which was also later revived in Renaissance Italy. Rather than some kind of form of ancient form of cancel culture, this was a dynamic practice rooted in community. Perhaps those communities were more cohesive, but in part this was due to their mutual negotiation of the past. So by being mindful of who history is for and who produces it, the public in public history can be recalibrated. The plural pronouns, our and we, can mean more than simply white citizens. memories of the past can be restorative rather than humiliating. In Wales, the heritage of the imperial past has tended to fall into familiar traps. And one of those has been the paradigm of what we call uncritical imperialism. So the National Trust Penrhyn Castle, built out of the profits of sugar plantations in Jamaica, has not offered a direct confrontation of its problematic history until the Sugar and Slate exhibition of 2019, quite late in the day, really. Elsewhere, the Welsh history of race and empire has been grafted onto a narrative of liberal progress. And this was exemplified, I think, by Brecon Town Council's bizarre decision to memorialise Thomas Phillips, a slave trader and captain of the Royal African Corps, for his supposedly liberal remarks on race in his book, A Journal of a Voyage. In 2019, the unveiling of a plaque dedicated to the role of Welsh black soldiers in the First World War also symbolised the difficulties of creating an integrated memorial to the multicultural past. The plaque was added to the Welsh National War Memorial in Cardiff, a tokenistic tagging on of black history. But it's unsurprising that one of the most effective renderings of the imperial past has stemmed from Welsh people of colour themselves, who commemorated the centenary of the Cardiff race riots of 1919. And one wonders what could be achieved if initiatives such as this were able to run on more than a shoestring budget. Given this week's announcement of a full review of statues, street names and building names in Wales, it may be possible to find out. And refreshingly, the review will be led by Gaynor Legal, a grassroots leader in Welsh heritage diversity and participant in the 1919 project. So it seems fitting to end this talk by returning to the point on which I started, which is to reiterate how memories of the past are constitutive of the present. The indignities suffered by Black lives in the midst of everyday social interactions is a product, at least in small part, of memory and the management of the past. The removal of supremacist statues and involvement of Black communities in the reconstruction of an integrated heritage is one means by which Black dignity can partially be restored. It will not right all the wrongs of the present, but it will empower Black citizens to tackle them without being dragged down by the weight of the past. It seems that statues really do matter for Black lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. I think you've given us a real useful methodological framework to continue the discussion. I won't get drawn into a Celtic nationalism debate with you, my friend, but we might slightly disagree on that. So that's great. Thanks very much, Chris. So I'll carry that on myself now. Can you see that, Chris?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to talk about memorialization in Welsh history. I think one of the issues that haven't been addressed in this current debate, certainly in popular media and popular culture, there's been a seemingly jump straight from in Colston's case, certainly as the first example of this, from Colston's actions to the statue coming down with not a great deal of discussion about why the statue was erected. So this is something Chris has touched on. So the key point for me is 1895, and again Chris has mentioned this. I don't know if you can see that the plaque there. The Colston's erected by the whole populace of Bristol. I'd certainly challenge that. I think the events of 1895, the events that led up to 1895, would suggest that the Colston's memory was appropriated by various political factions. That's the inauguration of the plaque in 1895. There's some contemporary images as well, and obviously there's an original portrait of Colston. So why 1895? Why approximately 170 years after Colston's death was the statue erected? And what is that going to do with Wales? Couple of interesting, there we go, that's better actually. So that's the Cardiff Times 1874. The Colston anniversary celebrates different societies, dining in different halls. The Anchor Society is liberal, the Dolphin conservative. That they perpetuated themselves for about 50 years. So every Colston anniversary, which would stretch over 2 weeks in November in Bristol, there'd be a liberal meeting, the Anchor meeting, a conservative meeting, the Dolphin, and also another meeting. So it was all about appropriating Colston's memory. The pious memory, this is obviously liberal, the pious memory of Colston charities. So, and again, this is more than 20, or just about 20 years before this statue was erected. So Colston is as an idea of republicanism, as an idea of a charitable person. What does that do? How does that relate to Wales and Welsh? You have to excuse the image. That's a screenshot from Welsh newspapers online. Liberals believe that excuse me. So Liberals are trying to appropriate Colston's memory, the endowment of free schools, and Conservatives believe that because Colston was living 200 years previously, that proves he was conservative. So there's the idea that Colston can be used for political gain in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and right throughout into the early decades of the 20th century. If you're interested in Colston, this is actually an excellent book. The retelling of Colston myth each year through parties, dinners, poems, songs became a key part of society in Bristol right through the second half of the 19th century. It's not just linked to South Wales. Certainly the impact of this Colston society and these events permeated right throughout Wales. That's obviously the Flint Observer. The idea of, again, this is a Dolphin society, so this is linked to conservative ideas and Tories, perpetuating empire, perpetuating colonial preference, and obviously decrying the radicals and the liberals. And again, the idea that Colston's statue was erected through popular donations in Bristol is false, really. The majority of the money that was raised to pay for Colston's statue being erected in 1895 was actually contributed allegedly anonymously by J.W. Arrowsmith. Arrowsmith, so a historian from Bristol, erected by the citizens of Bristol as a memorial for one of the most virtuous and wise sons of the city. I won't go into any depth of Colston as a slave trader. I think we've seen that quite extensively over media, and lots of people have spoken about that. And again, quite conscious for time. So, 1895 for me, the key point with Colston. The key event, why was he crystallized? Why was that memory crystallized in 1895? And how does that relate to sort of public enemy number one in Wales then, which was Edward Picton. The first shots in this Welsh discussion were aimed at Picton, and again, there's seemingly a jump between 1815 Picton dying in Waterloo or Picton's actions in the first decade of the 19th century in Trinidad, straight to 2020, without any reference to the period he was memorialized. The Picton statue was erected in 1916. It's actually, if we had a little bit more time, we could investigate this a little bit further. The Picton's monument in Carmarthen is a completely different entity, a lot earlier, for different motivations, for different reasons. But I'm really drawn to the Picton statue in Cardiff Museum. 1916, so what was going on in Wales in 1916? there's a military service bill that comes in 1916. Lloyd George is made Prime Minister at the end of 1916. Obviously, you got July 1916, Mametz Wood, increase in casualties, increase in conscription. The slide is from British War Memorials. A makeshift cemetery just off Mametz Wood. You've got Christopher Williams' painting commissioned as well. So 1916 is a pivotal year in Welsh culture. It's a pivotal year in terms of what Wales is represented by. This is taken from the Aberdare Leader, just a couple of months before the dedication of Picton's statue. We charged the wood like madmen. Oh my God, we made a charge. The observers have watched us said it was better than being prayed, and so on. This is, if anybody who's not local to South Wales, the mount would be a reference to Mountain Ash. So it's a key point. 1916 represents something in Welsh culture. So Picton, again, I don't think this has been discussed very widely. Picton's statue goes up as a part of a series of 6 statues representing Welshness, Welsh heritage, ideas of being Welsh. So dedicated or commissioned by Lord Rhondda and dedicated by the soon-to-be Prime Minister Lloyd George. So we've got David ap Gwilym, St David, Gerald the Welshman, Owen Glyndŵr, Henry VII, Hywel Good, Prince Llywelyn, Bishop Morgan, Picton, and William Williams. Lots of different ideas and representations of Welshness. Obviously Picton statue was there to represent Welsh as a warlike nation. So where's the actual? That's the actual dedication that appeared at the same time as that report. Massive volcanic character. So in terms of a warrior, you can see why he was lauded in 1916 purely in terms of a warrior. Died on the battlefield of Waterloo, the highest ranking officer on the Allied side to die at Waterloo. Absolutely terribly played by Jack Hawkins. If you ever see the film Waterloo, who has a record of playing poorly in Welsh war films. And in Zulu, he's quite awful in that as well. But so Picton as a victorious or as a valorous warrior is an image for 1916. What did Picton really represent? If you take that back a century, if you look at the newspaper accounts, and indeed this is from a primary source, this is from a contemporary account of Picton's first trial. Picton as governor of Trinidad, tortured on quite a number of occasions, well-documented occasions. This one, quite crucially, Louisa Calderon. This process was actually came to be termed as Pictoning in contemporary culture. One wrist was tied to a pulley, pulled up, the toe of one foot on the spike of a wood, one hand and foot were tied together. There's lots of contemporary images, some more sensationalized than others. This is actually, and again, from that trial account. A man to be memorialized? I think not. This is an account from the Cambrian in 1806. I won't read that, but I think that the back end of the sentence perhaps illustrates some of the even more complex issues surrounding race, the attitudes to slavery, the attitudes to lots of different things. Yeah, very, very difficult. quite interesting actually. If you want to look at this any further, if you look at Cambrian's response to Picton's eventual, he was convicted in 1806. He was eventually then that decision was overturned in 1808. If you look at Cambrian's accounts of 1808, completely different. They suggest Picton was innocent in terms of following Spanish law, not British law, and they justified that. So interesting. Okay, coming back to what Chris was saying, Colston or Picton or some of these other figures, I understand why they were memorialized in 1895. I'm not justifying that, but I understand that. I understand why Picton was memorialized in 1916. I'm not justifying that, but I'd suggest that as a culture, as a society, that we've moved on. That both them statues reflect 1895 and 1916 respectively. So I think the importance as moments, but certainly don't affect the culture we live in now. Something Chris mentioned. I've got slightly more of a problem with this, and I think Chris come across as perhaps he did as well. This is 2010. I think by 2010 we're a different culture than 2016, and that's Chris alluded to the liberal remarks. I just can't see how you can justify putting that statue, that plaque up in 2010. I've got some real issues with that. Yeah, so that's for me. So I think really that's me trying to get across that memorialization in terms of Colston, who began this process, and Picton as well, and the Captain's Walk in Brecon. It's about a moment in time. So you're plotting 3 moments in time. So it's the events, it's the point of memorialization, and it's now. So I think that this whole series of talks is about collective memory or contemporary conscience. I'd suggest that they offer both. Right, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. We're lucky enough that we've got we'd be joined by Neil Evans. Neil is, sorry. Sorry, so Neil.
Am I in?
Yeah, I tell you what, I could give you an introduction, but I'd need a drum roll as well. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Neil.
Right, I'm Neil Evans. I'm Vice Chair of Llafur at the moment. And I've done lots of other things in Llafur in my time and written about a wide variety of things in Welsh history. I want to take up some of the things that Chris and Darren have said and give one particular example. Sorry, I haven't prepared anything visual, but if you've been into the centre of Cardiff, you've almost certainly seen the statue of John Batchler, the friend of freedom, as it says on the plinth in the haze. I remember many times seeing his outstretched hand having a pint glass in it, which shows the reverence with which it was held by drunks in the middle of Cardiff. But as Chris and Darren have said, statues are not sources for history, but what they do is enshrine views of history and which great men, because they're almost always great men, that we're meant to venerate. Now, to understand Bachelor's statue in Cardiff, which was erected in 1886, I think you just have to set it in the context of the way that the history of Cardiff was constructed in the 19th century. There's an official view, as it were, and this was that modern Cardiff was the creation of the second Marquis of Buttes. He said famously, "I will make Cardiff another Liverpool," and he made other comments about how great he was going to make Cardiff. And the argument is that because he opened the dock, the West Butte dock in 1839, he was the creator of modern Cardiff. And the docks were seen as central to that. 1839, then a second one in 1855, other Butte docks which dominated it. a couple of years ago or so, and it's been repeated more recently, the BBC in Wales put out a documentary on the Bute estate in Cardiff, presented by Suzanne Packer, which enshrined this view. Everything in Cardiff had to do with the Bute estate. And I got quite angry watching it, and I thought, I want the right of reply to this, because it wasn't the only view of the history of Cardiff which was propagated in the 19th century. But the official one was commemorated in the statue. The second Marquis of Bute was at the bottom of St Mary Street in those days, and that was what you were meant to venerate in one of Cardiff's main streets. Now, as well as the Bute estate, liberals and middle-class people would have said that they made 19th century Cardiff as well. Yes, of course, they were sort of grateful to the Marquis of Bute for creating the docks, but he did it to make money, they would have said, rather than for the particular good of the place. And many others came to Cardiff to do the same thing. So we had a whole host of liberals who had made Cardiff, and they had been dismissively referred to by E.P. Richards, the second Marquis of Bute's agent, as the wharf gentry, as a sneering term. Now, the champion of the wharf gentry was John Bachelor, born in 1820 and died in 1863. Very much the leading liberal in mid-Victorian Cardiff. Well, what did he do? A whole host of things. He raised the issue of the Corn Law in the 1840s and propagated that. He was central to sanitation in Cardiff and opposing the Bute estate on that because they were ratepayers and they didn't want to pay money for sanitation. Church rates, every radical cause Bachelor was central to. And when he died in 1883, even the Western Mail said of him, the Western Mail, of course, is a Tory newspaper, in those days anyway. We can argue about what it is now. Carolyn might have something to say about that. To him, more than any other individual, the radical section of the community were indebted for the position which they have been able to hold. So Bachelor was a symbolic figure of a different history. Other people had made it. One of the liberal phrases was always, the castle is not Cardiff. It is not the same. And there was a different way of looking at the Bute estate. The Marquis of Buttes, the two Marquis of Buttes of the 19th century, were often seen as being like the Tsar, repressors of liberal opinion, persecuting their enemies. It was said that Bachelor, who was a shipbuilder, had been driven out of business and into bankruptcy by the Bute estate. So they could be looked at in a much less benign way. There was also criticism of their economic impact on Cardiff because they often failed to expand the docks fast enough, and people felt that the town was being held back by the fact that the Bute estate wasn't spending enough money on it. Hence, 1865, Bachelor was one of the main people who put forward the Penarth scheme. So there was an alternative port created. Later, of course, after Bachelor's death, there would be Barry as another rival. But these were always opposition to the Bute estate. Bachelor died in 1883, and the statue by Milo Griffith was erected in October 1886. It was unveiled in 1886. So I should have put a picture there, but if anyone's been in the centre of Cardiff, they've almost seen it. But I think you need to look at the iconography of it. Underneath, it says Friend of Freedom. That's a criticism of the Bute estate. It's in the haze, which is parallel to St Mary Street. Remember, the second Marquis of Buttes in St Mary Street. So there's the alternative history in a parallel street, almost level with him. And he's got his back towards the castle, if you think about it. And I think that may be symbolic as well. He turned his back on it. On top of that, he is outside the Free Library, which had been opened in 1882, the Cardiff Central Library. If you're as old as me, you spent half your life working in there, or half of the first half of it. And that was also symbolic because the Bute estate had argued frantically against it. They didn't like spending money on the rates. The third Marquis was very keen on his own artistic and education and his command of all kinds of languages, but he wasn't very keen on sharing it with the rest of the people. So putting it outside the library was also symbolic. And initially, the council had intended putting a large tower on the library, which in the end they couldn't afford. But the point of the tower was it was going to be higher than anything on Cardiff Castle. So there's symbolism going on in the architecture there, and another view of history is being enshrined. Well, in 1886, there was a great controversy over it because the Tories wanted to move it. They didn't want it where it was. It was in too prominent a position. And they published in the Western Mail in 1886 or 87, around then, a mock obituary of Bachelor, a new inscription for it. And it made a few references. One of them was this citizen of Newport. He'd been born in Newport in 1820 and had only come to Cardiff in the 1840s. So he wasn't local, was he? Resident of Penarth. Well, yes, he wasn't living in Cardiff again an alien and an outsider. And there was also a reference, he left his country for his country's good. The reference apparently was back to a play about transportation. We know that Bachelor went to New Brunswick to learn the shipbuilding trade in 1820. The Tory accusation was he'd gone because he'd been involved in the Newport Rising of 1839, and he thought South Wales might be too hot for him and had gone to Canada to escape from the law. Now, I've never been able to find out whether that was true. I asked David Jones many years ago, great expert on Chartism, and he said he'd never come across him. And I think I asked Malcolm Chase as well, and the people who were great experts on Chartism never seem to have come across him. That doesn't tell us whether he was involved or not. He would have been 19 in 1839, and he was always of a radical disposition. Some people in Cardiff said they well remembered him addressing Chartist meetings in the town many years ago. But I think that was probably in the 1840s. And there was a radical movement in Cardiff in the 1840s, which didn't call itself Chartism, but was similar in all essentials. And I think it might have been that. And it's at that time where he became the leading figure in Cardiff liberalism. John Batchelor's sons weren't pleased with Lascelles Carr, the editor of the Western Mail, and T.H. Ensor, who had written the mock memorial. And they waylaid him outside Cardiff Central Station and used their dog whips on him. They were then summoned for assault, and they said that there'd been a criminal libel on their father, which had hurt them. They lost the action. It's sometimes said that it was the action which established that you couldn't libel the dead. That's not true because that was well established in law. But it did settle the issue that if you libeled the dead, you weren't affecting a living person. What I've been trying to illustrate is that the statues in Cardiff illustrate different conceptions of what the history of the town was, and they were contentious in the 19th century. Tories threw paint over Bachelor's statue in 1887, and I smiled quietly after I went to Cardiff after St David's 2 had been built, and I thought, I think they moved him a few feet to the south. And, you know, in the 19th century, that would have led to all hell breaking loose. You know, no one would have shifted Bachelor's statue. So the issues over statues are not entirely new things. They could be contentious in the past. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too long. That's what I'm going to say for now.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Neil. And again, that you're right. That builds on what myself and Chris said. That the statues are really contentious in the period they erected, just as contentious as they are now. So I learned lots then, to be honest. Thanks very much, Neil. So just taking us to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Hywel Francis, founder of the South Wales Miners Library, former LP for Aberafon, current president of Llafur, and most importantly, former driver for the Rhondda Mayor, Annie Powell. So how are you about?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. So over to you.
Thank you. I was only a driver twice in the general elections of 64 and 66. I wasn't employed by the council. I really enjoyed all the contributions, and in the light of the contributions already made, I'd like to slightly change my title. I can't even remember what my title is, but I want to call it now Learning from Our Forgotten Memorials. I want to talk about two works of art in Swansea, which are arguably amongst the most important examples of public art in Wales. One was commissioned explicitly as a memorial, and the other as a celebration, and has become a memorial. They are works of art forever associated with 20th century Wales. They should be both iconic and universal in their recognition, and yet little is really known of them outside Swansea. Unlike so many of our statues, these are true works of art. They are multi-layered in their meaning and eternal in their intrinsic worth in interpreting what I call the human spirit. First of all, Frank Brangwen's British Empire panels in the Guildhall, which is often called the Brangwen Hall, but it's in the building called the Guildhall. Commissioned by the House of Lords to hang in its royal gallery to commemorate the British Empire's role in the Great War, they were rejected in 1930. They were deemed inappropriate, too exuberant. Rather than celebrate military conquest, they celebrated the diversity of the empire through the beauty of its people, its flora and its fauna. Westminster's loss was Swansea's great gain, thanks to the wisdom of its council. And I should say that the council in more recent years has produced a series of different booklets. This is the most recent one that's available, I think, and you can see the image there. This was in 1987, so it's clearly out of print, but it's a very beautifully produced booklet. The decision by the Lords surely cannot be unconnected with the fact that many of the hereditary peers were the immediate and direct descendants of slave owners who awarded themselves vast sums of compensation for the abolition of slavery less than a century before. To have images of the
So I did that, but well, when you turn it away and moving away from the mic, we losing you a little bit. If you could,
okay,
that's much better. Thank you.
I'll start again in that sentence because it's the key part of my presentation, really. The decision of the Lords surely cannot be unconnected with the fact that many of the hereditary peers were the immediate and direct descendants of slave owners who voted themselves vast sums of compensation for the abolition of slavery barely a century before. To have images of people of colour, men, women and children, looking down on them was an intrusion that was, to use parliamentary language, inappropriate. One peer, Lord Newton, called it too exuberant. Any decent memorial is as much about the future as the past. Andrew Green, the former National Librarian, under his pen name Gwastir, wrote a politically perceptive essay for his blog in February 2018 on Brandon, where he interprets Brandon giving a sense of hope growing out of the anguish and the slaughter of the Great War. Andrew ends with these prophetic words. This is a paradisal view of the future, when the planet is safe and humans can share the earth rather than ruthlessly dominating and exploiting it. So next time you go to the Brandon Hall, look at the panels. Think of William Morris's apprentice, Frank Brandon was an apprentice of what it was. And think not of great wars, but think of Black Lives Matter. And my second work of art is Joseph Herman's panels, Miners in the Griffith. The Jewish Polish refugee, survivor of the Holocaust, and proud citizen of Australia in the Swansea Valley. He was commissioned to produce what became the iconic image of the Festival of Britain in 1951. He said his panels, called simply Miners, not the Miners, Miners, were his most important work in Wales. It was to symbolise the new Britain which the miners had sacrificed so much to achieve. However, with the passing of time and the passing of miners into history, Joseph Herman's panels do not simply represent the undoubted quintessential portrayal of the dignity of labour. I always think of Millais when I see Joseph Herman's work. They are now more, for me, a celebration of something very personal to the artist Joseph Herman. He is thanking the South Wales mining community for the sanctuary and the fellowship he gave to him as a Jewish refugee. And the people of Astrid thank him in turn through educating us all about his life's work with this wonderful Joseph Herman Art Foundation today. So next time you go to the Griffith, ask to see the panels. Ask likely when will they be on permanent display? And think of Joe Barr as he became known within 3 days of arriving in Astrid during the war. And think of the Holocaust. So there we have it. 2 memorials in Wales to celebrate and not to pull down. I'm delighted to hear that the City and County of Swansea is reviewing its public art, and I'm sure it will place its works of art by Frank Brandon and Joseph Herman right at the top of its list of those that they wish to continue to display, most of all to educate its citizens and indeed the world about Wales, about slavery, and about the Holocaust. And there's, can you see? There are the panels. Yeah.
Fantastic, thanks Hywel. Some of this come up in the chat is, you know, perhaps we can all submit a text of our talks as well. I think that'd be quite handy. I know I think Chris has already done it. I'm sure Neil and Hywel would be happy to do that. Again, another fascinating talk, and I'd remind everybody, if you want to put questions in a chat and address them to any one of us, that'd be great, to be honest, because I'd like to think that we'll spark a reasonable debate at the end of this. So we come to our final speaker. So Carolyn Hitt, who's a broadcaster journalist, and she's told me to say she's a Rhondda girl. She's just across the mountain from me in the Rhondda Fawr. So I'm in the Rhondda Fach, so we're not far away. And Hywel mentioned Astrid. I'm sure she'd think Astrid was a different place to Astrid Gunlights, but there we go. So Carolyn's going to speak about the Hidden Histories campaign. So over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you very much, Darren. Just wanted to say thanks for the invitation. I actually rang Darren last week to ask could I record this session, and he said, well, can you be on it as well? So I'm very privileged to be in such illustrious historians' company, and I'm feeling slightly the odd one out, but there we go. Yes, I'd just like to tell you really about the Hidden Heroines campaign and the journey myself and several great women in Wales have gone on to make this possible. It's interesting, you know, we've had so much controversy lately about should we take certain statues down. It's not been an issue for women because we hadn't really put them up in the first place. And one of my favourite phrases is, you can't be what you can't see. And I think that's been a huge problem for young girls growing up in Wales. I remember Deirdre Beddoe, you know, I kind of consider that the godmother of Welsh women's history, wrote, gosh, way back in the 80s, that culturally Welsh women are invisible. Whereas, you know, the very fabric of our communities is kind of carved with male achievement wherever you look. And, you know, you struggle to know that Wales is the land of our mothers as well as the land of our fathers, because we've just not celebrated the achievement of women in the same way. And I think half the battle with that has been letting people know who these women are in the first place. You know, it is his story rather than her story so many times. And as people, our kind of desperate ignorance of this has twice been illustrated by national polls. Way back in 2004, you might remember we had the 100 Welsh Heroes, which was a Welsh government campaign at the time to celebrate great figures from Welsh history. And at the time, it was the largest online poll ever conducted. Around 80,000 people took part. And so how many women made it into the 100 Welsh Heroes? 9. And who was the only woman to make it into the top 20? Catherine Zeta-Jones. A few years later, the Welsh Government had another project called the Top 10 Welsh Idols. And this time, only one Welsh woman made it into the top 10, and it was Catherine Jenkins. And so why couldn't we think of any other significant Welsh women at that point? And it wasn't as if, you know, it was just about kind of celebrity culture, because, you know, Hywel was on there. He'd never been on telly, I don't think. But could we blame ourselves, really, the ordinary person in the street, when our female history is so invisible? And, you know, you just stroll around Cardiff, we've heard about John Bachelor, Fred Keener, Ivan Novello, even the choices within who we celebrate with male achievement are interesting. You know, Gareth Edwards had barely taken off his boots and we had a statue of him, you know, long before Nye Bevan. So that, you know, as I say, there's no shortage of visible men. I did find at the time when I was researching into this that there was a statue, an 8-foot bronze, in fact, of a Welsh woman from Llandudno, Dr. Martha Hughes, who was a doctor in the 19th century and a suffragist. And her statue was erected in 1996, but in Utah, where she'd become America's first female senator. And perhaps knowing her remarkable achievements would never be celebrated back in North Wales, she did the sensible thing and emigrated. And of course, it's a scenario that's been replicated across the UK and across the world. In 2016, Carolyn Criado-Perez, who's done some, you know, such fantastic work in tipping the gender balance back to equal, with a campaign to get Jane Austen on the banknote, and a recent book on how women aren't kind of thought of in so many aspects of consumer culture and marketing and manufacturing. And she basically listed every single monument in the UK, and of the 925 statues recorded, you know, this is just a few years ago, only 158 of those were women. And of those 158, almost half were allegorical figures. We're talking kind of nymphs or the scales of justice. And 14 were of the Virgin Mary, 46 were of royalty, and that left only 25 statues of historical non-royal women in the UK. So at that point, I wrote my column on it that week with a kind of, from a Welsh perspective, I tried to think of, were there any named Welsh woman I could think of in an outdoor space? I mean, in an indoor space, you know, we know that Thomas Picton's in the Hall of Heroes. Well, Boadicea is in there with him. And there was a generic statue of the Greenham Common campaigners. And there were generic Welsh mams, I think, of my own hometown of Llwynarpia, which got the lovely statue of the miner and the miner's wife. But, you know, not a woman who actually lived, somebody we as kind of, as young girls, Welsh young girls, women could relate to. So as I say, I wrote this piece, and it was picked up on by Helen Molyneux, who was a very successful lawyer, and at the time was the chair of the Institute of Welsh Affairs. And Helen and I had actually been in school. We hadn't crossed over. She was a little bit older, but we did know of each other. So she gave me a call and said, come out for a gin and tonic. I've got a plan based on what you've written this week. And she was kind of as appalled as I was by the lack of female statues, but she really had the firepower to do something about it. She's a very dynamic, fantastic person. And she knew that the Central Square development was underway. And as you probably know, when these large scale building projects take place, there's a pot of money set aside for public art. She'd seen the plans for Central Square, and there was a kind of suggested monument, and it was a giant dragon. We wanted a dragon of a different kind. And so Helen made it her mission to ensure that that money went towards a statue of a Welsh woman. And she put together a task force of women from across a number of disciplines, from the arts, from law, from the media. And we basically met up for about a year in a cocktail bar and researched it, tried to get these things underway. We got in touch with a company that acts as a conduit for developers and sculptors and artists. And Helen got in touch with Cardiff Council, went through the labyrinthine rules on how you get a statue built. And to be fair, Cardiff Council were very supportive from the start, and their only kind of stipulation was, we want an exciting work of art, and we want it to be the place where everybody has their selfie taken in Cardiff. So I thought that was a pretty good condition. And we wanted people to kind of have a sense of ownership. I mean, it's interesting, we've heard today about the Hall of Heroes, and there was an element of a Welsh public vote. I know there was a committee who had the final say, but I know the Western Mail at the time kind of put it out to the readers and said, well, who do you want to be celebrated? So Helen and I approached the BBC and said, you know, we need to get the Welsh public on side here, and get them to vote, get them to talk about who they would like to choose. We put a task force together of historians to think about who the long list should be initially. So we had a list of 50 Welsh women. The Welsh Women's Equality Network helped with that as well. We had an exhibition in the Senedd at the time with the pictures of all these women and blurbs about what they'd achieved. And then I wanted a shortlist of 10. The BBC wanted a shortlist of 5 because they wanted it stripped across the week, which I can kind of see the sense of. But even then, it was kind of a frustrating exercise where, you know, you'd had all these years and 2,000 years of Welsh history without now any representation. And even now we were kind of having to kind of shortlist these women down. But we came up with a shortlist, and I'll just remind you of it. And I'm sorry I've got nothing visual for you today, but you can click on the Hidden Heroines website and the Monumental Welsh Women website and see plenty of illustration of these women. And we had Elizabeth Andrews, a Rhondda, a Hirwaun-born but Rhondda raised woman, suffragist, socialist, very much champion of working class women, notable, of course, for the Pitted Baths campaign, transformed miners' lives and the lives of their families with that campaign. Betty Campbell, first black head teacher, pioneer of black history decades before any of the conversations that are going on at the moment, and just an absolute community warrior. We had Cronogwen, you know, described by Deirdre Beather as the most remarkable woman of the 19th century. What could this woman not do? Master mariner, preacher, poet, campaigner, journalist. Elaine Morgan, who I had a particular soft spot for because she was someone I knew as a heroine of mine. She changed the world, really, didn't she? From her desk in Mountain Ash, excelled in the arts and science, one of the pioneers of TV drama, but also brought women into the story of evolution and became a kind of heroine for the feminist movement in America. And Lady Rhondda, you know, somebody who you might say, oh gosh, well, she had privilege, but boy, did she use that privilege in a fantastic way. I mean, she went to prison as a suffragette. She became a global businesswoman. She's the reason women can sit in the House of Lords, also a great journalist. So a fantastic shortlist. But even then we were kind of getting a bit of sniping, you know, from the people who really knew their Welsh women's history. They were saying, oh, you've only got 5 and it's a beauty parade. For women who knew nothing about Welsh women's history, they'd say, who are these people? You know, well, that's the point. So it was an interesting time, but overwhelmingly it was positive. We had children sending in their drawings of the statues they'd like to create and the ballots they'd had in school. We also were retweeted by Bianca Jagger. That was quite an exciting moment. And when the vote was cast, I'll share this with the room. I'm not really supposed to share it, but I will anyway. We had more votes than sports personality that year. So that was a really significant moment for us. And the winner was unveiled on a projection on the new BBC building in Central Square. and it was Betty Campbell. And that was, you know, after the kind of division and the horrors of Brexit, the fact that Wales had chosen a woman of colour to be our first woman felt like a really emotional moment. In fact, I'm getting a bit choked even thinking about it now. It was a really, really special night. And the scenes in the Butetown Community Centre that night were something to behold. We've been tracking that whole story as well as ongoing in a documentary that'll be shown when the statue is unveiled. At that point, we thought, right, we've got our named woman. Who do we want to make the statue? And we had a short list of world-renowned female sculptors, and a panel that included Betty's own family chose Eve Shepherd. And again, if you Google her, you can see some of the incredible things she's done. She did Stephen Hawking's statue, for example. And though I can't reveal what Betty's artwork looks like, you'll have to wait until, and sadly coronavirus has delayed the making of the statue till next summer. It is truly the most remarkable artwork I think we'll have ever seen in Wales. It'll be a massive talking point. It'll be probably one of those Marmite things where you love it or you hate it, because it is just so striking and it's enormous. And it's also the first thing you'll see when you leave, when you arrive in Cardiff on Cardiff Station and you walk across the square, your eye line is drawn to this artwork. And, you know, I hope that all the little girls who will see it will want to be it as well. And, you know, that's what it was all about. From start to finish, was to make us visible, and I hope we've done that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carl. I actually feel your pain, because one of my day jobs, as Ian mentioned at the beginning, a project officer on Sporting Heroes RCT, so I'm trying to make that project as gendered as possible, and it's really difficult, because the last thing I want is to finish this project and say, well, where are the women?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I should add at this point as well. Well, 2 points I'd like to add. Another project I've been involved with was the story of the Welsh rugby players who went north, and some of the reasons behind that were people always thought they just went for the money, and often it was in terms of it was more about they were working class and needed to put food on the table, but also, you know, that the darker story of all was that they were black and they didn't have the pathway that a lot of our white players would have had. And there is a campaign underway to get a statue of Billy Boston and some of the other great Welsh black players of that era. Billy Boston has a statue in Wigan, he's got a statue in Wembley, and he hasn't got a statue in his hometown. So hopefully something will come of that. And also, as we know, statues are expensive things. There's a campaign to get the other 4 women on the shortlist made into statues as well. We hope across Wales, you know, towns and cities will kind of take up the baton for their own kind of local Welsh heroine. But if you look at the Monumental Welsh website and you would like to get involved, and, you know, I know these are difficult times for fundraising, but if you would, you know, like to give some funds towards it, then it would be a great thing to do. So as I say, you can, perhaps I can tweet the links to both websites afterwards. You can find out a lot more about the projects. And Betty will be with us summer 2021, and the television documentary on the story of the statue will go out that night.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Just, Hywel, can you unmute yourself, please? Yeah, fantastic. So we've had a few questions. If the first one's nice and easy. So Georgina Gittins is asking, she didn't quite catch where she can see the panels.
Which panels?
The panels you did. Yeah.
Well, the Brangwyn panels are in the Guildhall. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And the panel entitled Miners are in the Glynvivian Art Gallery in Alexandra Road, opposite. Well, it's the refurbished gallery, but they are. I was being careful in the way I chose my words. They're generally in storage, but are brought out. They're very large and they command the whole gallery, and they are brought out on special occasions. And I think the last time they were on display, there was a special exhibition in, I think, 2018. But you know, there are lots of people who feel that they should be there permanently on display. So that's the Glynvivian Art Gallery in Alexandra Road.
Great, thanks, Owen. A question from Rhys Owens. I just taken the last bit of it, Rhys. is there a risk of the importance of the Black Lives Movement being lost in Wales due to the perception of Wales being victims rather than perpetrators? So I'll throw that out to all of us, but you feel free for anybody to pick it up first.
But that's a hot potato, Reese. Thanks for that one. I think there is a risk, personally, and I think the use of the rhetoric around reparations was very misplaced. I think when you consider the history of reparations movements, which is only a recent history and really goes back to the 1980s, 1990s, I think there's a danger of obscuring who the real victims are. And I think, you know, nations, when they almost try to purify themselves into existence. And I think that can obstruct their relationship to the wider world and their own complicity, in this case, in the forces of imperialism itself. So yes, I do think there's a risk in that. But I also think that Celtic nationalism offers a great opportunity as well to satisfy Darren, who I know will come back on this. So yes, there's a bit sitting on the fence, but I think there's a risk. I think it's fair to say.
Okay, thank Neil.
In Cardiff, Kyle Legal has been doing artwork about the resistance to the 1919 race riots. I mean, clearly in those, black people were victims, but one of the reasons that the deaths in them were, you know, two white people and one black person, was that there was resistance. They were asserting themselves against the aggression. They defended themselves in Boottown and in other areas of the city. So I think it's possible to memorialize in other ways.
Hywel?
You can learn so much from other countries. You take the resistance in France. The most recent major work is by Robert Gildier, in which he actually highlights the cosmopolitan nature of that resistance. He attacks the nationalist version of it in France, namely that it was a French resistance. He says, no, it was not a French resistance, it was the resistance in France. And in amongst that resistance, some of the outstanding heroes were Jewish. Now, that kind of reinvents the history of anti-fascism in France, particularly, where it's saying that the Jews were not simply victims, of course they were, but also they were great fighters against fascism, and particularly in France. And of course, the diversity of that resistance included Catalans, they included Germans, Italians, and so on. France was the last major country to be invaded by Nazi Germany, and so you had all the refugees from across Europe had already congregated in France, and they were part of the resistance as well. To say nothing, of course, of the fact that the most rapacious co-owners in Wales were not English, of course, they were Welsh.
I'd have to agree, and I probably come from a slightly different perspective, but yeah, I think for me it comes back to that perennial question: when was Wales, and you know, Wales, and there's so much historiography out there. It's what point you pick. So Wales in the 19th century is a completely different entity to Wales in the 20th century or the 18th century. So yeah, I take your point, Reese, and I think that there is a risk there, but I also think there's a discussion there as well. Carolyn, do you want to?
It just goes to underline that, you know, when I looked into Betty Campbell's life and the fact that she was telling her pupils about Black Welsh history back in the 1970s, and we're only now having the discussion about how we educate our children, you know, in the fullest sense of Welsh history, because, you know, so many of the more unpleasant attitudes I've seen on social media in relation to the discussions we're having about Black Lives Matter stem from just this desperate ignorance of our past. You know, and it's great we're having an event like this as it is. I mean, I would point people to a fantastic initiative. It's a young Welsh woman from Boottown called Maimuna Solman, who has a kind of online hangout every week called the Privilege Cafe, where she invites people to just come and chat and examine some of the things that we're grappling with at the moment. And it's very much, you know, getting younger people involved as well. And, you know, I'm surprised by my own ignorance really about what I thought I knew a fair amount about our past, and but these discussions are making me re-examine our identity all the time, and in the course of some of the programs we've made, when we went on that journey to trace the story of the Welsh Rugby League player, I was deeply shocked that, one, that this had happened, but two, that I didn't know about it. That somebody like Roy Francis, who was the first black coach in professional sport, in any sport in Britain, who was from Bryn Mawr, born in Tiger Bay, brought in Bryn Mawr, and I didn't know his story. Why didn't I know his story? Who chooses what stories we learn and how we position ourselves in history. So I think a lot of good is coming out of the discussions we're having at the moment, hopefully.
I think you're spot on. I probably know more about rugby league. My mother's from Barrow and Furness, so yeah, I'm a big rugby league fan myself. So yeah, I've come across in my research as well. I've come across lots of instances with the rugby league players. So we need to have a chat about that off air and such. Right. Question for all our speakers: how can we make the membership of Llafur more diverse? That's a big question.
Through having more diverse activity, and we have really seen good progress, not enough, but good progress in the last year. Gaynor Legal was one of our key speakers in Cardiff at our annual general meeting at the end of last year, and next week we have an excellent program on anti-apartheid, in which again Gaynor Legal will be one of the speakers, alongside Hanif Bamji, of course, famously the coordinator of the Wales anti-apartheid movement. So we should have a more proactive engagement with the BAME community.
Thank you, El Presidente. I think you're spot on, and we've got lots of events planned throughout the summer. I got a very good friend of mine called Teo Loco. He's doing something for us later in the summer. So yeah, it's certainly something. I've been a committee member myself for 5 or 6 years, and it is really at the uppermost of all our thoughts, really. So but at the same time, we can only reflect trends in society as well. So we can do our best, but I think society needs to try a bit harder to be a bit more diverse as well as ourselves. So there we go. Sorry. Chris, could you elaborate? Sorry, did you want to jump on, Neil?
No, I'd only endorse what Hywel said. I would have said the same, but less eloquently.
Yeah.
Well put. Chris, could you elaborate on the relationship between statues, monuments, and collective identity? And not just Chris, we can all speak about that.
Yeah, I think that's a theme that runs through all of our talks, and I think actually Caroline's talk perhaps was most pithily summed it up, which was in that phrase, "You have to see it to be it," and I think we can sort of unpack that a little bit. I mean, in my own talk, I talked a lot about memory as a constituent of identity, and I think statues, monuments, they are memorials. They make us think about our past, but then we need to question who is the our here. So we also need to think about public history, and that's why I think the initiatives that Caroline has been talking about are absolutely wonderful, because they are redefining the criteria of community, and in the sense rebuilding what it means to have a collective identity. So memory is part of that, and language is part of it. We've discussed about the fact that statues themselves aren't history, but discussions and debates about statues are. As we discuss, as we do other campaigns around our heritage, we build up a language which has power and which then becomes a part of our identity. And I think that's how collective identity, or at least one route through which collective identity can be formed.
One thing I've wondered through this whole kind of journey is statues themselves seem to belong to another era of memorialization. As Chris was talking, I was fascinated when you were talking about antiquity, their kind of methods of changing their heroes. And having gone through the practical kind of side of what it takes to make a statue, the costs are eye-watering. They really are. We're struggling to get anybody behind Elizabeth Andrews as a kind of focus at the moment, because she's from the area I'm sitting in right now, and they're on there, and the money's not there. I wonder, can we think more imaginatively in the future with all the technology that's at our fingertips in other ways of memorializing? And there's a fantastic day in Ireland, which I think is called Her Story, where they project images of great Irish women on the big buildings of Dublin, and it's really striking. And you wonder, you know, whether there's scope for kind of ever-changing murals. You could have a different heroine every week on a space in Cardiff or Swansea. And so, you know, statues themselves seem to belong to a kind of more privileged form of acknowledging somebody in some ways, because you, as I say, you need a good fundraising campaign behind one, and the great and the good to get behind that fundraising campaign in many instances.
I think that's really interesting, and this almost sounds scripted. I'll come back in 2 seconds, Howard. We've had a secondary follow-up question from Kim Colebrook. How can public artworks be enhanced and integrated into other activities to contribute to expanding a more rounded idea of identity, which is exactly what you said, Caroline. So I think, yeah, Kim, I think that's definitely something we need to address. Sorry,
yeah, it would be great to think more laterally, yeah. Yeah.
Howell?
I wasn't wanting to speak. I just...
But yes, you can go to the toilet.
As you have asked me, I find it quite intriguing, really, in Parliament Square. Nelson Mandela's statue is the one that's the smallest and the shortest, and it's the one, in a way, that's nearest the people. It's life-size, and you're almost walking alongside him, right? And the others are much grander and more domineering, you know, the one of Churchill and the one of Lloyd George. They're very commanding. I did attend the unveiling of the Lloyd George one, and a certain parliamentarian was struck by the fact that the flag was the Union flag, not a Welsh flag, and I thought, that's bizarre. Of course it's going to be a flag. It wouldn't be a Welsh flag. It's a British politician, not a Welsh politician. Anyway, you can argue about these things, and I find it's sad that Sylvia Pankhurst, appropriately, Sylvia Pankhurst will have a statue in the East End of London, but I feel that, my personal feeling is, beauty is the eye of the beholder. Sylvia Pankhurst is a much more significant person than her mother, but there we are. That's my opinion. But and this is a serious statement. You know, I was shocked that Labour members of Parliament voted to, along with others, to have started to Margaret Thatcher. And I just said to Tony Banks, "Why did you do that before I entered Parliament?" He said, "Oh, because I wanted to be the first in the queue to pull it down." Well, that's kind of typical kind of Tony's jokey way of addressing politics, you know. But these are serious matters, and I found it quite absurd that that statue should have been erected, particularly in her own lifetime. There we go.
I think a far more fitting monument was the number one record when she passed away. But there we go. That was far more fitting, in my opinion. I don't think we've got any more questions, but I'd like to thank all our speakers. You know, just to have nervously being involved with such eloquent and superb speakers. I feel like I'm surrounded by giants, a dwarf surrounded. Oh, I can't say that. Sorry, a leprechaun. Yeah, thank you. Surrounded by giants.
Has anybody seen the James Larkin statue in O'Connell Street? And if you have, what are the words underneath?
Ooh.
And like all great words, I think they were borrowed by him. They were plagiarized. The great appear great because we are on our knees. It is time for us to rise. And then right next to it, there's this kind of a strange kind of 1980s statue of a young woman lying down with water running over her. And the people of Dublin have called it, I don't know what it's supposed to represent, but they called it the floozy in the jacuzzi.
Well, I got to finish on that note because I can't think how we can top it. Again, thanks everybody for contributing. Thanks everybody for listening in and viewing our presentation. Ian, are you still out there? Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. Yes, indeed. On behalf of Llafur and everyone, I'd like to extend grateful thanks to Chris and Darren for offering fascinating perspectives on the highly contemporary issue of veneration and memorialization. Thanks to Hywel, Neil, Carolyn for their brilliant contribution. And thanks to all of you, the audience, for your comments and questions via chat. With a thanks to colleagues Darren, James, Sean for their help in organising the event. Very smooth, no real technological hitches today. Just to make a plug, our next, as Hywel alluded to, for the audience, our next online event is going to be a week today, the 18th of July. It will be a roundtable discussion about the history of the anti-apartheid movement in Wales. We do have a diverse audience, diverse range of speakers for this seminar, full details of which will be sent out to members imminently and also put up on the Llafur website and Twitter page. I do hope you can join us for this. If there's anyone here today who was not yet a member of Llafur, I hope you will consider joining us at the very reasonable price of £15, unwaged £10. Again, details of how to subscribe can be found on our website. Thanks again. Many thanks. Bye now.